it is never legitimate for states to comment on the domestic politics of their former colonies or territories. I would like to invite Prime Minister to start with their speech whenever they're ready. Hey, hey. Also, I will be sending timestamps in the chat. So, like at 1 minute, 6th minute, and 7th minute.
Hello. Okay. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Hello. Imagine someone slapping you in the face, and then they later come to a position to tell you that how should you not get slapped in the face. We think that's exactly what the former colonies are doing towards their former colonizing countries in status quo. So what are my contexts in this debate? Number one, understand that in status quo, most of the time, social and economical chaos of these countries are most likely the consequences of colonization itself. An example is like Malaysia become is very racially divided because of the segregation the British had during the colonization era in order on the basis of divide to conquer. Or Jakarta even having those kind of social status because of the kind of the former colonizers did to them and how they kind of divided their city into different parts based on their social status. Now let's just move on to talking about what is commenting in this motion. So we think commenting in most scenarios is about the former colonizers going on to the media, going on to reporters and telling them about how this kind of countries has been affected and how we kind of need to save this kind of countries. But what are the impacts of commenting on media? We think that in most cases, when they kind of make these kind of statements of this kind of countries are not working, that's why we need to help them. What media often does is that they often sensationalize or even dramatize what they're going through. And what they really do is that they further propagate this kind of white savior complex. Because in order to for you to actually help them, you need to kind of create an image of yourself as if you're helping out your former colony. And then they often create this kind of image that the British or even your foreign colonizer is doing something about it, and is actively doing something about it to help to compensate for their wrongdoings. But we see oftentimes they aren't actually doing anything about it, and it's just a mere image the media is showing their citizens so that they can make them feel okay. So another thing is that we oftentimes don't think that the media actually reveal the dark side of history or what the British or whatever Netherlands really done to these people. And other than that, my third setup will be on the fact that this is a value judgment debate. So the outcomes of this debate is not important, and it's mostly based on moral high ground that you get. But fourthly, we say that the safeguard of these debates is that number one, other countries we do not need to defend other countries who are not colonies of us, such as if we are Malaysia, we do not need to defend the US because the US hasn't colonized us before. And we think that in a worst case scenario where a country really needs help, what they can get is that they can get help from other countries or even get United Nations peacekeepers to actually help them. What is our burden to this debate? Number one, we just need to prove to why it's unjust to get this country, the former colonies, to help us because we think that it's inherently their fault. And secondly, we don't yeah, that's all. So now moving on to my arguments in this debate. Number one, on principle, on how oftentimes this kind of this is why this is inherently unjust, because we said the reason why countries are put in such situations are because of because of what their former colonies really did to them. So what they did was that they stole from the underprivileged and kind of make them really economically stable. And now they're coming out and saying that we need to save you all from all these kind of situations. You need to do this so that your economy can be better. But this is all their fault, and not all their fault, but like majority of what's happening right now is actually their fault because of the kind of former colonization's thoughts, like divide and conquer, or even separating social status in order for them to gain an upper hand doing what their ancestors formerly did. So we say that all this kind of former racism within like Malaysia, it's all actually part of a consequence, a part of results based thing that came out from what they did. So now moving on to my second argument on how this is only going to make everything worse, because we say that this is a form of whitewashing in where the whites are just using this as using this sort of commenting or even media attention to just wash out the sins that they have committed in the past, and then you just use it as a reason to not compensate them, because now they're going to say like, oh, we have already commented, we're already trying everything we could to actually help them, it's just that they're not doing anything, it's not our fault. So other than that, we see that in most cases the whites aren't really able to help with anything at all, because understand what the West does is that they oftentimes just generalize a simple fact. They just generalize everything and things. Like they think that what the West has done, now the East needs to do the same as well. But we believe that on our side that there's no one fits all theory. So what they might be proposing might not actually help or might not actually cater to the needs that this developing country really needs. But furthermore, what the West might be proposing might also further harm the people within their colonies, such as i.e. the West asking to build more railroads, or in the West asking to further develop your economies, while ignoring the fact that we have cultures to keep and that we have certain groups of peoples and minorities we need to protect over the further developing your economy. And why is this making it worse? Why is such commenting making it worse? Because what this does is that it gives a leverage towards the West. So how is this leverage gained? In most cases, this leverage is by ingraining a social narrative that we must save our former colonies. And why is leverage inherently harmful? Is that it gives them a reason, it gives them a justification to intervene in their politics and economical scene, saying that like like look, because we have so-called this moral obligation to help them, so we need to intervene. It's this kind of reasons that actually put developing countries in very dire situations, because they can't reject them, because now the developed country oftentimes have this sort of leverage to actually help them. Sorry for not taking any PR, sorry, I need to finish my arguments. um and secondly, we say in most cases, what this West really does is that they're not actually helping to intervene. In most cases, what they're only doing is that they're only putting sanctions to make the economy worse, such as how they put sanctions on Iraq and how them, they were unable to further develop, or even blocking trade in the first place. So we don't think, from what the status quo and the trend has shown us, the West has actually helped anything to help the developing countries be better. More likely, they're going to just cause proxy wars, like what they did to the Middle East, benefiting from selling weapons, benefiting from selling medical supplies and everything. And lastly, we say that this is inherently harmful because this is a form of whitewashing and white superiority, and it's the reason why that's so-called racism and Asian stereotypes, or even black stereotypes happening. Because what often they do is that they sensationalize and dramatize the ideas that most oftentimes in the East there are human rights abuse, and the East aren't really that great. That's why we need to help them. And this is why it keeps this kind of superiority in mind towards the white people. And this is why it further propagates the harms against minorities and harms minorities in Asian countries. And we think that this is unjust in nature, because it's further harming other people on the ground, and it's further propagating and ingraining these kind of ideas towards your own citizens. Never been further proposed. Thank you.
Speaker for that fine speech. Now I'll call upon leader of opposition to give their speech whenever they're ready. Here.
So, am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you. So my speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Society issues have to be treated in every country, and all countries are connected, and they should support each other. And this motion should not be taken because it will lead to a world where each country is isolated from each other, and that's not how the world should be. So we're very proud to oppose. So firstly, I will give you why the rebuttals, and secondly, I will give you why these states can give good comments, and thirdly, I'll give you why this is why it's justifiable to give the comments, and fourthly, why the formerly colonized countries need advice. So firstly, rebuttals. So firstly, the government side said that the media will sensationalize like the comment, but firstly, as authorized states, they won't. Government never explains why these states even have the incentive to make sensational comments, and B, the media won't be involved because this is a comment done by legitimate authorization. And C, the reputation of the state is at hand, so they will try to they won't try to make sensational comments. And D, they need to show that, so these states still need to show that they are legitimate states and authorized states that can be valued and seen as important by other states. So I think we have clearly made it clear that media won't sensationalize, and even media won't even be involved, because I'd like to add, government said that commenting is just going on to media, but we say that commenting is just giving advice or giving analysis as to like what's happening in that country, and it's not something big like invading the country. It's just making a statement. So moving on to our first point about why the states that used to colonize the countries can give good comment. So firstly, this is because they know most about how they influence the country that they used to colonize. For example, they have background information about how they alter the system in the country that they colonize. They have statistics they have statistics. Like, for example, in England stopped like most domestic production of cotton and salt in India, but they actually have more information as to how they like which parts of India they actually try to control and which parts that they stopped production, right? Since they know well about the country, they know what kind of people, like ethnicity wise, personality wise, they know what kind of people exist within the country, and therefore they can give advice based on the knowledge. And by doing this, they will be able to give comment that is more suitable for the people in the country and the circumstances that the country is under. No, thank you. Secondly, so this is very important. So after colonization, there is no need for the country to uphold the colonization, right? There's no more need to try to force people to, for example, make them work as laborers. Therefore, the state is more likely to have good intentions. Why? Because the reason that the colonization was ended in the first place is because they have agreed that both countries are on an equal status. There's no conflict. There's no slavery and no up and down relationship. The country doesn't bring back the past history. It showed that each country have agreed with each other, right? So therefore, the country that used to colonize the other countries will have good intention. And thirdly, when we think about the characterization of the countries that colonized the other country, this is part of a rebuttal to the government side. They said that the West will somehow lead to worsening the economy because there are like white supremacists, but that's not true, because obviously they're more advanced in areas such as trying to protect human rights. So therefore they're actually more likely to promote like modern day human rights movements, right? So why this is justifiable, why commenting is justifiable. So firstly, because after all, it's up to the country to decide whether or not to take the advice and agree to this comment. And secondly, therefore, there's no real harm in just making a comment. No, thank you. So next, about why colonized countries, the formerly colonized countries, need advice. Firstly, let's think about the characterization of countries that colonize other countries. These countries, because they had enough resources to colonize other countries, they were usually developed, like the US or England or Japan. That's why the comment will have an impact to some extent. Because why? Because most countries in the world trust developed countries. No, thank you. Because people know that A, they're being watched by other countries, and B, there's always a reputation that they need to hold that developed countries. No, thank you. Two, if the states are feeling the need to comment, then there must be something that is wrong with the former colony. Unless there's something serious happening, that they wouldn't need to feel to comment. So next, so what would be something serious enough to comment on, right? In order to think about this, we need to think about the characterization of countries that were colonized. Due to their colonization, their development was hindered, such as by like restricting domestic production, right? These countries are usually small and not fully developed, but by something serious, it would be something like, because it's a small country, it would be something like people's rights are being violated, or like somewhere there's autocracy. This is something that would be serious enough to comment on. So what can be done with the comment? So with a comment from such developing countries, impact can be done. So firstly, because the whole world will start paying attention to the problem that they're giving a comment on, and secondly, the world will take the problem seriously because because I already told you that the developed countries are usually trusted. And thirdly, because people will try to take the problem seriously, it will be more likely they will be more likely to try to solve the problem. Therefore, it is fully legitimate for states to comment on the domestic politics. So we're very proud to oppose.
Speaker for that fine speech. Now I'll call upon DPM to give their speech whenever they're ready. Here.
Hi, my name is Supe. I'll be going as DPM. She, her, they, them pronouns, POIs verbally, but please don't keep asking unless I still don't take you by 5:30. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the whole of OO's case can be taken down by one single setup that is already said by Yushin, which is that we do not need to defend no countries commenting or no countries helping at all, because all we have to defend, if like the British previously colonized Malaysia, then the British probably should not have the legitimacy to comment on us. But we don't think that we have to defend other countries like US, other countries like China, other countries like Russia, or like even the UN helping us when we have serious human rights abuses, or like when we really seriously need the help by UN for them to suggest some like ways to prevent climate change, or like ways to upscale our economy. So we think that with that setup in and of itself, we can really take down the whole of their case about why like you really need to comment because developing countries know more, or how these developed countries need advice, because we think that on the worst case scenario, we still can get advices when we really need it. But the problem is that we think OO never engaged with our principle about why it's so illegitimate for you to slap someone in the face and then now teach them back. This looks like, like the US abusing or like having a lower social status for the Black people in America, and then now demonizing them, saying that, oh, African Americans are all criminals, and demonizing them within media. We think that it's not just for them to say that it's not involving media because firstly, we think that for them to comment in the first place, they have to use the media to comment, or like even if they don't, their comment will directly be inflicted within the media. This means that media will make this kind of demonizing or like reports. But even if they don't do that, they're just commenting. We think that that is also not just, because the reason why these countries got into this state in the first place is because of these developed countries who colonized us, divided and conquered, which causes it to be so bad in status quo. I'll take you later. So by then, we think that a lot of OO's case already did not stand to the moment where they did not engage with our principle. But then let's still quickly take out OO. So we think that firstly, let's say that, oh, they will not be invading, they will just be commenting. We don't think that that is true because oftentimes it does involve things like sensationalization, saying that, oh, this country in Iraq is really, really, really bad. There are human rights abuses and then we just have to do something. We have to sanction them. We have to I don't know, military intervene them. So we think that a lot of these cases actually often happen, but what if that don't happen? Then sure, this means that their case makes exactly no impact. So what is the impact of just saying it in your Twitter account or something? We don't think that that has any impact to helping these developing countries in the first place, which means their case completely does not make sense, which means that our principle about these countries not like shitting on them after colonizing them makes a lot more sense to the extent where they don't help them anyway. Then they tell us that, oh, you don't need to take them. Yeah, so this is when their case has completely no impact in the first place. But you have to recognize, why don't they want to take them? This is because the amount of hurt that they've caused towards us. Malaysia, if British did not take away all our natural resources, we probably can't have enough economical development, which means that in status quo, like the white flag movement does not have to exist in the first place because we have enough resources to give everyone the basic living instead of everyone just suffering. But then some country is the West, now say that, oh, Malaysia is foolish, the government is failing, they can't even give the people enough ability to survive. We don't think that is just, because the reason why this is happening in the first place is because of them. They cannot do this to us after robbing all our resources. Then they tell us that you need some advisors. We don't think that they need advisors, but even if they do, we don't think developing countries take their advisors in the first place. So this means that it doesn't really help. But yeah, before I go on, yes.
Model is literally the UN, when the literal UNSC is run by US, UK, France, and Britain, which are the four main colonizers. So principally, no one can actually go to the UN for help if that is your mechanism. Yeah?
Well, I think the WHO is pretty neutral to some extent, but at least they're not the ones who are directly doing this. But even if that is the case, we think that developing countries are able to survive on their own. And like in the second argument, we've already preempted that. We'll tell you why it doesn't help and it makes it worse in the first place. So this is also direct preemption to what CEO might say. So now let's talk about why it actually makes it worse, or like it doesn't help in the first place. We talked to you about how this is a form of whitewashing, and often they do not help in the first place. If they're just defending, commenting, I am unsure as to how this is going to directly better the case within these developing countries. But you also have to notice that there's no one-size-fits-all theory. You cannot just say, oh, you have to like improve your democracy index and everything will be better. Oh, you just have to have this climate change plan. But they do not recognize the real scenario within these countries, which is we have a lot of people still suffering on the ground because they took all of our resources. So we think that it is best for these developing countries to make their own decision. We don't need them to demonize us. We don't need them to like comment on us. But why does this often make it worse? We think that this is often seen as a leverage this often creates a leverage from them, integrating the social narrative, that the white savior narrative that you have to help them. But this also further propagates what my PM already told you, the Asian racism and then the inferiority within Asians ourselves. This is because the idea within media or just like within the Twitter accounts of these people often saying how like underdeveloped or how bad these developing countries are, while painting them as the savior who is here to save everyone, even if with their statistics, even if whatever. We think that this further propagates a kind of white savior and white superiority. And with all the Asian racism or like Asian hate crimes happening in the US, even if they're able to help, or like even if it's the UN or whatever, we are unsure as to why this is the just thing to do in the first place. But then why did my PM tell you that it's unjust in and of itself. This looks like a stronger party commenting on a weaker party. Like they're the white savior here to help everyone. It's like me commenting on a weaker debater and say, oh, you're not good. Like you just have to do this when they never asked for it in the first place. This also looks like commenting on someone that is disenfranchised. For example, commenting on the African American who stole because they were underprivileged and out of necessity, and they don't have the necessary means for them to be economically stable in the first place. And now you're commenting on them and say like, oh, we have statistics to say that African Americans always steal, which is untrue in the first place. So we think that when this is often their fault, they divided and conquered us. Almost all of the racism is caused by them. Almost all of the economical problem is caused by them. And not to mention, they themselves human rights abuse us. They themselves still have human rights abuses within their countries in and of itself. We are unsure as to why this is a legitimate mean, especially when they are the direct people who colonized us in the first place. We think that of all these reasons, we're really, really proud to propose OO cannot stand, and we have preempted CO. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for that fine speech. Now I call upon DLO to give their speech whenever they're ready. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. So, my speech starts 3, 2, 1. We think about the world that although there is a country that so much suffering, how to govern the country, all other country can't put comments and all they can do is disregard the terrible situation. And is this the world should be? No, we strongly promote the world that each country support and give comments each other. Before moving on to our reconstruction, first I'm going to rebuttal what the government side has remarked. So we have 3 rebuttals. First, they said that why would they sensationalize? We have 2 responses here. First, we repeated told you don't have incentive to that due to their place in the world. They have reputation to uphold. And second, it is much more advantageous to keep as many countries as possible on your side. And why? Because the country always want good trade patterns. And the second rebut is they said that serious human rights abuse can be solved by United Nations. We have 2 responses here. First, the more states exist, the more people will be focusing on the problem, and the more recognition the issue will get. And the second, no, thank you. The whole world listen more to countries like US compared to UN. No one listened to the meeting done by UN, but everyone listened to President Joe Biden speak. And so we believe that why? Because every country always wants good faith patterns. So next, I'm moving on to our reconstruction. So first, so if we take this motion and every country cannot comment, former colonies cannot comment to the country that is ask for help, nothing can be started. So if we take this motion, nothing can be started. All they can do is just disregard the help and what's the situation. Why? And because subsidizing the money or intervene the politics.
COI.
No, thank you. It's from comment in the talks. Why this is so bad? The country if we ask for help will worsen the worse. The country don't have solution to rebuild the situation, and those and 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 after all, those countries will bankrupt. Of course, it is harm to country that are suffering the situation, and also one country's economic situation will affect the country all around the world. So this harm will lead to global economy also become worse. So if we not take this motion after plan or after plan, the former country can comment to the country that are help for
Here
that.
I.
No, thank you. That ask for help, and former colonies help the country. And then
Wait.
what happens? No, thank you. One is doing commenting the country on former country know the situation and think the resolution, and then the start to give money, aid, or help to rebuild new institution, or educate the knowledge, educate the country how to govern the country and how to recover the situation. So the situation will become better and better, and the country can get out of the terrible situation that sees to the bankrupt. The impact is here. The nation, Philippines, and the countries will get more benefit. First, get out of the poverty. In the status quo, the country who are suffering from the terrible situation are so much in the poverty that they are so much terrible. They spend in a so much terrible situation in these poverty, and then they can get out of the poverty, and the sanitary systems are improved, and therefore the environment that
Here
they
I.
are live will be better and better. Therefore, we are strongly opposed to this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for that fine speech. To start with the closing half, I'll invite member of government to get their speech whenever they're ready here.
Oh, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Is everyone finds me recording my? I guess it's fine because the whole debate being recorded anyway. So I'm going to record my speech. All right. Just getting my timer ready. My debate will start in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that it is extremely hypocritical for a nation to criticize a nation, that they stripped the resources, that they exploited, the people they brutalized, and the lands that they oppressed, right? So our debate is going to go as an extension and rebuttals, all right? Okay, now, let's talk about what we heard from the opening side, right? OG did a good analysis of the status quo and why there is harm, right? However, OG was insistent on talking about moral judgment, which is a good metric, but it's lacking in the sense that they lacked practical mechanization and analysis. Also, OG lacked any impact on stakeholders, resulting from their lack of practical analysis, right? But we still agree with the principle of OG, like in a sort of hypocrisy they talked about of nations that exploit the lands, of nations that created the problems, right? So we agree with OG on that point, right? Right? So OO had a naive understanding of the world where they strangely focused on the nitpicking of OG's mechanization. First of all, they asked, why would the news sensationalize? We know that the news sensationalize. That's how they get views. That's how they get revenue, right? It's literally an industry model that, like, if it bleeds, it leads, right? So they strangely also defended colonialism. They strangely misunderstood the debate, and they characterized former colonies as nations that need to always be helped like a damsel in distress, right? So a couple rebuttals for OO, right? So let's talk about how they were talking about like how former colonies need advice, right? This is the logic of asking the burglar of your house for tips on home security after your house was robbed by them, right? These nations may know better, but the advice is extremely hypocritical. Also, right, even if we ignore the hypocrisy in principle, all right, the way that their information, their knowledge was utilized was in a tyrannous way, has no relevance today because it should not be repeated, right? So they were talking about like how UK knows about cotton production in India, right? Okay, so Belgium might know about like rubber production in the Congo because according to that metric is based on productivity, but they're forgetting that the way that they got these high numbers, the way that they got these productivity was from abuse that should not be repeated today. So their advice is no longer necessary because their advice is strictly linked towards the abuse of colonial peoples, right? Okay, now let's also talk about how they like they're saying like, okay, colonial nations, like former colonial overlords, they're coming from good intention, right? This point is a result of the lack of characterization from the opening half, right? I'll characterize the actors in this debate again, right? Former colonial nations, like lots of these nations, went through revolution, went through large conflict, went through genocides because of their misconduct of the former colonial overlords, right? And let's talk about colonizer nations, right? These states that we're talking about, like Western liberal democracies, that from the get-go are more powerful, more economically powerful from the start. So it's so unfair that these nations criticize, like even though they had like hundreds of years of like better um development, right? Okay, they also talk about how it leads to like worse economy, but it's hypocritical considering these colonies are the ones which get commented on, are the ones suffering because of the West's original human rights violations, as I said before, right? So basically they defended colonialism, they like rejected the notion that these nations were like the former overlords are the ones that created the conditions. They're just blind to the status quo. And now I'm going to offer you my extensions, right? Like also just one last rebuttal on the they're like, okay, we have to help these nations. They're asking for help. Okay, if they're asking for help, let's go help them, right? But we're talking about the unprovoked comments. We're talking about the unprovoked criticism, right? We're talking about those things. Also, just a reminder, I'll be taking verbal POIs, but only from opening opposition, right? Okay, so my extensions, right? Neocolonial, right? Extensions one, neocolonial, right? The problem was opening was because they did not go deep enough about the practical reasons and practical analysis for why this motion should pass, right? I'm going to explain to you why comments of the former colonial overlords leads to the rise of neocolonialism, right? So everyone on this house, everyone here must agree that colonialism is inherently bad, right? It's like a stripping of liberties. We're talking about which side and that, right? So obviously, right, because opening they lacked characterization, they lacked all that. They didn't talk about burdens, right? So let me reintroduce the burden of this debate, right? So basically, throughout this debate, opposition has to prove that like commenting on it, the criticism of it, and the outcomes, the sort of backlash that comes with it, are favorable, are better, are just when compared to the moral principles and when compared to the practical results that come from staying silent, right? Because like I said, like these issues are still going to be criticized anyways, right, by non-colonial nations, like by the non-colonials, right, as opening government numerous times said. So like, okay, let me just remind you of that and tell you why specifically former colonial overlords commenting it leads to neo-colonialism, right? So it pushes the narrative, like two reasons for this, right? Pushes the narrative that things were better before. So if this is a comment made by like a non-former colonial overlord, then this nostalgia isn't there, right? If the US talks about like South Africa, that's just like a separated critical comment. But if the UK talks about it, it's instinctively linked with the UK's role of it. It's instinctively linked with apartheid, right? Let me give you an example here. Let's talk about like Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe, former UK colony, right? Far-right white nationalist groups in the nation in former Rhodesia because of the UK's constant criticism of the nation who believe the former apartheid rule was better. Like this is a nostalgia that they're pushing for, right? Leading to the civil war and conflicts in Rhodesia. So we see that like when the UK criticizes it, they're instinctively supporting like apartheid. They're instinctively supporting the colonial policies that hurt many people. And we think that's as a liberal democracies, these nations have no right to say this, right? Because the UK, when they comment, because of their former status as colonial overlords, it's this instinctively tied when it's different for the US because they don't have a history of that, right? Okay, and it also makes people adopt the narrative of like white saviorism, which is like, okay, this was said by OG, so I'm not going to expand on this, right? Yes?
So don't you think that if colonized nations are hurt, they can just ignore the comment while still the problem or the issue?
So that comment comes from the lack of mechanization because like they can't ignore, especially when the entire international community will jump on and use this. Like let me talk about why they will jump on, right? So former UK colonies in Africa after criticism gets bad reputation from the international community. This happens in these countries, right? So they won't go back to Western liberal nations because of their revolution independence, right? So when we're creating even worse colonial systems, because these nations start to believe that they need an overlord, but they won't go back to the West. They won't go back to democracy, right? So they're going to go to China, like we see in Africa. Former UK colonies are now becoming neo-colonies of China, right? This is exactly what's happening. Okay, let me give you a specific example, right? Sri Lanka used to be a UK colony. After they left, the UK constantly criticized ethnic conflict, the conflict that they created, and then now China indebted Sri Lanka, and there's an entire port owned by China, right? Lastly, let's talk about like like the principle, right? It's denying responsibility, not in their right. So like let's talk about like, oh, the UK constantly criticized the Israel-Palestine. It's like religious warfare, oh, Muslim fundamentalists, but they created the borders, they created the ethnic conflict there, right? So they're unnecessarily fueling tension, even though it's their problem, right? They're not taking responsibility. So let's just say, as a moral principle, these nations have a right and have a duty to take responsibility, right? And it also, like, if they actually stop commenting and they start looking at it critically, like they start apologizing and stuff, it leads to reparations and donations, something that's favorable than neocolonialism, because we're saying that the continued comment will lead to neocolonialism as we have mechanized. All right, thank you for listening. Very happy to propose.
Thank you, Speaker, for that fine speech. Now I call upon member of opposition to give their speech whenever they're ready to hear you.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So let's get one thing straight. We think that O is like very, very unresponsive towards the principal mechanisms that OG and CG has brought about. So that's what we're going to do here today, which is bring about like principal and practical reasons as to why this particular action is legitimate. So the first response we have towards an argument that OG brought up was that they say social economic collapse is purely caused by like colonies, which is bad for like these colonized countries. So we disagree for 3 reasons. The first is that this is not true. To a certain extent, we say that colonizers left behind systems of political governments and economic management, right? Be it authoritarian or democratic systems, things like managing ports and the entire free market system to begin with. So you can't say that colonizers were inherently bad in like occupying a particular place, even if they are like, extractive of a particular situation. I think the second thing that OG ignores in particular is also the semi-peaceful transitions to power by colonizers, in particular the UK and France as well. So they're all the success stories of Singapore, Malaysia, and to a certain extent Indonesia, right, where there's a gradual transition to democracy. And in the past, these colonizers did have an incentive to peacefully transition these countries to democracy more often than not. So even if the freedom was 4-4, right, in say like places like Indonesia and Africa, we say that many economic mechanisms are left behind for the state to utilize like properly, right? And there's an incentive for these colonizers to educate these particular like people who run the economy as well. And this is where we go on to the third and most important part of the rebuttal, which is that not everything is the colonizers' fault after decolonization. And people within that particular country make active choices to make the country worse. The reason why they have a choice is twofold. The first is that they are free to choose the people in power, right? In terms of like the democracies that have been set up for like colonizers in them, in the case of Singapore and Malaysia. The second, right, is that they're free to form like organized groups in anarchies and form their ability to take power and make stable governments for themselves. So the thing is, within these particular, no thank you, within these particular countries, right, people are not shackled. They're free to choose how they want to treat their minorities and people, irrespective of how like their colonizers chose to treat these particular minorities. So it does not explain like 3 like particular discriminatory actions that these like colonies take upon their own people, right? It does not explain the heightened discrimination based on like race, class, and gender in countries like Malaysia and Rwanda against the Hulus and the Tutsis. It does not explain the social economic harm caused by economic mismanagement and oppressive assimilation and corruption processes. It also does not explain the genocidal practices in African countries post-colonial withdrawal as well. Therefore, colonizers do have a right to comment on the political and social instability that exists within these countries, which is independent from whatever which is largely independent and caused by the choices of oppressive individuals. I think the second idea, right, I want to bring up is that this idea of like colonizers, like, oh, it's like the colonizers' fault and whatever, right, is commonly used as a trope by incompetent governments to justify their existence in power, right? Like, oh, I'm doing the best job I can, but in reality, these governments are extremely corrupt and oppressive as well. So that's one thing. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the idea of the white savior complex and how it's like part of racist and discriminatory action when people just say, oh, I want to comment on like the bad state of your economy and the oppressive nature of your country. So that comment is somehow oppressive. This is a logical fallacy. Think about it, right? If one murderer, say murderer A, comments on the harm that another murderer causes, which is murderer B, Prop is saying that the impact of the latter murderer like outweighs the impact of like the former murderer, which means to say that it doesn't take away from the legitimacy, even if it's the colonized like countries commenting on these particular issues, because these are real issues that do affect the domestic and geopolitical stability of the region. So I think irregardless of whatever your oppressor did to you, right, it does not mean that your oppressor cannot comment on your crimes against humanity. That's the first point. And I think the second point, right, is that these colonized like countries, these colonizers, right, can't just make like very, very racist statements or overtures, right? You underestimate the media's ability to call out these racist statements to begin with, and it's extremely politically unstrategic to do so. I think the last thing is about domestic politics, right? How there's a link between how domestic politics like affects the entire regions. For example, how South Africa or like Tunisia's domestic politics affect the entire like region stability as a whole, and colonizers still do have a vested interest because they do have trade routes going to their country and stuff like that. So now we are going to prove, right, why colonizers like the UK and France are in a unique position to comment, and why they're inherently justified to comment on these particular issues, which is independent from whatever fluff that OG gave us. So I think what these comments can be is that it can be framed as part of solving your own problem that you cause, right, through colonization. It's not necessarily hypocritical for you to say that I want to apologize for my past mistakes, right? That people change and countries do change in their political stances and stuff like that. I think that part of solving a problem is that you created is about calling out all the problems within your own colonies, right? And making meaningful overtures to help. But before that, POI from OG.
Yeah, do you agree that a lot of the political discrimination is directly linked to the dividing and conquer for decades that caused segregation and hate? For example, the May 13 issue.
I do agree specifically in the case of Malaysia that is true, but it was the choice of Malaysian politicians to continually exploit like the Chinese people in the future for political gain, so I don't see your point. So as to why colonizers do have an incentive to help, right, there's two reasons. The first is that currently they tend to be the sponsors of democracy and self-actualization, right, especially for individuals or like countries that are trapped in oppressive regimes, and these aren't just like simple crimes that any nation can look past and look past, right? I think the second part, right, is that these particular comments and like future contributions also mean a part of an apology, right, and restorative action into establishing like economic relationships within like these colonized countries, because these colonized countries need help, right? And this is directly counter to the point that CG wants to bring up about neo-colonialism and stuff like that. So having the ability to comment on a particular country's domestic politics for these colonizers mean that to a certain extent they do want to intervene like economically and like socially to help these particular countries. And the reason why this is important is also to like weave out like foreign interference, but mainly it's also a means for like reparation and apology whatsoever, right? I think even if it is hypocritical for these colonizers to comment on these particular issues, it is still important for them to do so. The first is that the base level of awareness that is generated from like a reputable like figure of human rights, for example, the UK or France and democracy, right? This message is necessarily more powerful than whatever other messages like countries like US, who is like currently experiencing political turmoil, or authoritarian countries like the USSR and China can make. So that's why colonizers currently are in a very, very unique position, right? Not just to just give reparations, but to spread like awareness about particular issue by politically intervening into oppressive regimes that have been set up by the choices of like oppressive individuals within these like colonized countries to begin with. So the debate isn't just about like bashing like colonizers and stuff like that. It's not that simple. It's a debate about geopolitics, and it's also a debate about how best to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for that fine speech. To close off the debate from Gov Bench, I would like to call Government Whip to give their speech whenever they're ready here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'm the government whip, and I would like to start my speech now. Now, let me go through all House's arguments to tell you judges why we as a closing of a government case even in front of the opening government, right? I'll be starting with the case they have white superiority complex and why it is principally wrong because of hypocrisy, right? To some extent, we as a closing government, we support the opening government's case, right? We also believe in the white savior narrative and how it will somehow fuel Asian racism in the opening's case, right? But the major distinction between our case and theirs is the true impact that we can bring, right? They tell you that white superiority complex is bad because A, it magnifies B, right? But as the closing government, we offer something bigger because we see the true impact and the true problem that neocolonialism will bring, right? We say that it is bad, not just because how economy might be damaged and how racism will be a thing, but we say that it is far worse in a far worse case in our side of this debate because of how history will repeat itself again and neocolonialism will eventually lead to recolonization and the rejection of potential for a former colony to like thrive, right? Moreover, our second argument offers an insight into the urgency to the issue, which the opening government could not do, right? While it feels attention colonies because of comments, right? We gave the example of Israel and Palestine, right? Why the act of commenting will lead to the worsening of the issue, not just with neocolonialism, right? Those things happen gradually and eventually, but we tell you on our side of the house, it will have a direct impact, right? It's such a bad thing because it directly impacts attention and international relations. Hold on. I am lagging a bit, so I will be turning my camera off. Why it is such a bad thing because it directly impacts attention and international relations, right? It is beyond just simple talks of economical interference and racism, right? We offer a greater impact than the opening government's case. Next, talking about the principle, we do agree the case of hypocrisy, right? And we add to the case by talking about why the denial of hypocrisy is also a problem. How denial of responsibility by a big state is something that paints a bad reputation of them in the international stage, right? These are our differences with the OG case in terms of principle and practicality, right? I will only take POIs from opening opposition, right? Next, the closing opposition. They talked about how not everything is the colonizers' fault, right? Well, yes, we agree, but they're largely responsible. Hence, it is something that they should take responsibility of, and the denial of responsibility is simply just going to worsen the international relations. They also talked about there are discrimination of former colonial nations. Closing opposition say these things are not resultant from the colonial withdrawal. We are strongly against the point, right? Two examples. First, the Israel. Second, the UK's failure at leaving behind the stable democracy, and also their arbitrary drawing of the borders directly contributed to the ongoing conflict, right? They said that the genocide in Rwanda was not because of the UK, but we know that the UK severely contributed to the conflict with their favorite of the Tutsi ethnic group, which led to the conflict after they fled, and the people were angry about it, right? The closing opposition extension, why former colonial nations should comment how it is okay, it is them making amends. Okay, we agree with this principle that nations should apologize, right? Like we said, we should come in the hands of donations and money contributions that can only come when they stop criticizing and commenting. Wouldn't it be ironic if Japan, instead of paying reparation, commented about the politics of South Korea as being military junta, right? Because Japan did not make any critical comments because Japan recognized their human rights violation and they paid reparation. The comments itself is not needed for regrets. Closing opposition also think they need to make comments, which we disagree with because as prop recognize that the comments can lead to bad outcomes, right? They also talked about how it is a debate about geopolitics. We agree, and this is why we think closing has a better debate, because instead of just focusing on principles and morals, closing was better able to talk about morals and practical geopolitical results, right? Geopolitical results that we're talking about in member of government speech about neocolonialism, right? They also talked about it is a form of apology, which relates to my early rebuttal, but as I said, apology can be brought by direct aiding or a compensation. And why does it have to be in a form of commenting? Because the commenting is simply just unnecessary. We also define commenting as criticization and criticizing. So it is therefore not an apology. It is only the abandonment of responsibility and throwing shades, right? Finally, to the opening opposition, I will not be talking about them too much as my partner has already spent time in his speech rebutting the case, right? As my teammate has said, they defended colonialism and the mindset of colonial nations and portray the image that colonial overlords only think good, exactly the white supremacist ideas that we as a government side, what we have been saying. The alternative that we as a closing government can provide instead of states to criticize them and comment on things. We believe the idea that aiding is far more effective than simple commenting, right? While the opposition team can say that it is not mutually exclusive, we're simply saying that that aiding and helping can happen without criticization and comments that actually portrays a bad reputation and strengthen tension. Now, I would like to compare the worst case scenario of the two houses, which will be the practical impacts that all the houses bring. Now, let me talk about the worst case scenario of side government and side opposition, right? we tell you that why we as the government side propose the best case scenario, and furthermore, why we as a closing government offer the best case out of all houses. Now, the government side talked about racism, right? How it will bring hypocrisy, how there will be economical interference, right? And that came from the opening government. But we as the opposition, a closing government say it will actually the repeat of history will happen, the total rejection of a potential to grow, and second, the failure to claim responsibility, and third, the strengthening of tension, right? However, on the opposition case, they do not have a worst case scenario because their worst case scenario of our side is simply letting the former colonized countries to thrive, right? They don't have the bad effects. While we as government side, we can tell you why the act of commenting it will actually lead to like a worse world, while the opposition team, they cannot say that, right? We tell you why this act of commenting is so bad, while the opposition team, they did not really have a worst case scenario, right? Why our world is so bad, because they're only talking about the idealistic gains that it will bring, how it will be a form of compensation, but they do not recognize that compensation can go without commenting, right? Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear to us why this debate was won by we as a closing, because we took the principles of this debate and also added geopolitical and practical analysis. Proud to propose. Thank you.
Speaker for that fine speech. To close off the debate, I'll call upon opposition whip to give their speech whenever they're ready. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I'm in speech in 3, 2, 1. Go. I'm going to be doing 4 things in my speech. First, I'll get rid of OO because it did an absolutely wank job at anything. Second, I'll take out like CG and OG and point out why specifically they're going to lose this debate. Specifically CG, right? Because CG just does absolutely nothing, right, in this debate in terms of just contribution. Because CG just parrots OG and goes, we are now CG. Yeah, I'm sorry that doesn't win you this debate given the fact you're actually derivative, right? Let's think about OO first. It's pretty assertive because all they do is good intervention, there's more advanced, something very, very sorry. Yeah, like Gov Ventures like refuted a lot of that, so OO is out of this debate, right? Gov case, right? 2 tensions here. A, on one hand, colonies can really stick together and fight together and can survive, right? In the same breath, the entire government benches like characterization of these countries are they are really broken, they're absolutely terrible, they're economically screwed, there's racial inequality everywhere. Yeah, if that is true, then I don't know how the individual country is going to be solving that independent of colonizers who also have a lot of power. Second, the things like CG is like extremely bizarre. Oh, but we can comment but cannot, and criticize and cannot, but then intervene can. Hi, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, because the premises of both Gov teams is that given that they are terrible, you cannot intervene, right? I.e. that due to the moral irreprehensibility of both of like all of these colonizers, any sort of intervention then is then seen as an irreprehensible, morally terrible thing, right? So them like literally coming up and being like, yeah, we can intervene but cannot do anything is one of the strangest things I've ever heard in my entire life, right? Second, let's talk about the responses here, right? Cool. They say colonization is morally bad, and that's the first argument we get. 3 things that was never responded to from WIT. Yeah, first, individual ruling also played a part. Let's not pretend Marcos did not have a part to play in terms of the militarization of Philippines. Yeah, or that like Najib had like, or that like colonization meant that like Najib had like something to do with the corruption in Malaysia. Yeah, like those things are independent given the fact that like decolonization is a self-determining, right? That means that like after they left, the governments that people led and the things that the people do are the kinds of things that you are able to do. Second thing, right, is that let's flip CG's argument as well, and that's the only unique contribution they have. They talk about nostalgia. Yeah, nostalgia also is the plain reason as to why specifically many of these authoritarian countries don't accept, not only not accept important help from the US and like from main colonizers who are giving important pieces of aid, but also the fact that like, and also the reason why authoritarian states in general are the reason like continue to exist, given the fact that populist governments can continue to exist. The outcome is very simple, right? 1, I think that like it's not morally bad, right? 2, and oftentimes many of these things are caused by these individual countries, right? Second thing, right? Let's agree with the premise that colonization was bad. It's still morally legitimate for them to talk about these things because literally, like the cause of independence and your own mistakes are something independent of the colonizers' mistakes. So, like, guys, if it is true, right, that a murderer had says that murder is bad, that is still a true statement. So despite them being hypocritical, sure, right? But the things they're criticizing probably still has a large amount of depth to it, and it's still probably pretty bad. But let's agree, let's assume, even if it's true that it's morally bad for them to colonize and like for them to comment on these things, right? It's morally even more reprehensible on their side to sit back and do nothing. It's the whitest thing to colonize entire countries and go, that's it, right? It's now your problem and your own problem to solve, because morally speaking, I don't have any like thing to do anything, right? The fact that like you are literally controlling, right? This is the funniest part, because OG went, I want to have UN and WHO. Yeah, US, UK, France, Britain, UNSC, yeah, US, UK also like directs most of SEC, also directs most of like SETCOM, also directs most of like a lot of the UN operations. I'm sorry, but like those things, like if you don't want them to intervene, they won't intervene. Yeah, given the fact you don't allow them to comment on your countries, right? Therefore, I think that your ability to solve these things and your ability to actually repair, right, like the kinds of things that you want to have done to those nations, right, i.e. the fact that you're irreparably screwed over these nations, necessarily also means on their side of the house, they don't allow any sort of reparation for those kinds of things to occur, right? If this is true, I think that necessarily also means you're even more morally reprehensible in terms of just washing your hands and just doing nothing. Second thing, an argument, right, that they talked about was, but what about white supremacy and media things? 4 responses. First, we know, yeah, because we initially got colonized. So like our ancestors, great ancestors, all got whacked by white people one time, yeah, by one time group one, right? That also means that like we don't just forget and like we don't just go, yes, white people very good. Second, colonization like colonization is quite widespread. Now we all kind of know that like white individuals just kind of suck in general. See, I think representation within media also means that terrible pieces of media often can be weeded out. Lastly, the structures to ensure that minorities are within media to rectify these things like diversity quotas in media and other social media platforms, like for example, Trevor Noah exists, and it also means that these kinds of media like don't get as much traction as they talk about. The outcome is A, is a lot harder than sensationalized, B, that like oftentimes you get immense amount of backlash when you try to put this white savior garbage, right? Last thing, right? Let's agree with the premise, right? And not the but let's not the outcome. I think the highlighting of these places mistakes is precisely to the point in which, right, like you tell the people that top model literally exists, ensure the intervention can then be needed. But let's take them at best case and white supremacy versus on our side of the house. Perfectly fine with that as well, right? Because if government's characterization like colonization is widespread and immense, the same structures exist on Gulf too, right? That like the media still have a huge amount of leverage against people. COVID still will be like pushed to Asians. That all the racial inequality still exists. The only difference then is their side refuses any sort of help coming from the white people. Therefore, in and of itself, necessarily not only means that you don't get the kinds of problems, like don't get the kinds of solutions. No, OG, and like you don't get those kinds of same solutions, and you don't get those same kinds of like intervention and aid that you necessarily need in these places. What was the extension that we told you was never engaged with by CG? So good luck with that, CG, right? I think one, right, we told you that the premise is that the mistakes need to be called out, right? Because these are human rights abuses that happen within Burma and people are dying in droves in Tatmadaw, right? These are, for example, like poor governance and corruption. People like Shaka, Zulu, Najib, right, who plundered the shit out of their countries, right? Where in these countries, they've ruined the lives of these people, right? These countries therefore need large-scale intervention in order to solve these problems, right? What is commenting and what has it done, right? It's made it better for these places because A, it has made it easier to mobilize those same individuals to ensure that these places get the intervention that they so deserve, right? The comments to step in and like to structurally have interventions in Burma, for instance, right? Or within these places, right? At the IMF and the World Bank, the recovery in the 1997 financial crisis, for instance, all needed to be hinged upon these big structures which are controlled by colonizers. Anyways, the second is that things like lobbying, in terms of lobbying power and the ability to get people out to pass bills, right? This also needs to like US and UK hold a huge amount of power in terms of being able to sway the opinion of these bills. Lastly, that is left on its own to foster is extremely terrible, right? They're like Burma genociding a bunch of its citizens is really not the best thing in the world. Yeah, OGCG claims that they don't need help. And they can fight by themselves. I don't know how the Burma citizens are going to fight the Tatmadaw without the US help. Good luck with that, right? What happens when you don't do anything on their side of the house? Nothing happens. That literally any of the help that comes from IMF cannot do anything because you're morally reprehensible to do so, right? I think that like number two, you're then also more morally reprehensible in the sense that like, you allow these countries to continue to worsen as you sit back, and the main cause of why they're worsening is also because of you, and you don't do anything to rectify that. So because our side is not the one that's more morally better, and also the one that practically helps these countries, very proud to be on closing up.
Speaker, for that fine speech, and thank you everyone for this wonderful debate.